Wanderstop has been among my most anticipated games ever since the Ivy Road dev studio was revealed in the 2021 Annapurna showcase, and it probably reached the #1 spot for me after the game itself was revealed last summer. If you've watched my previous video essays, you may know that Davey Wreden is among my favorite game writers/directors, with The Beginner's Guide specifically easily landing in my top 5 favorite games ever. Just that fact alone was enough for this game to be an instant purchase for me, but the contributions of Carla Zamonja from Fulbright and C418 made this release even more exciting. Now that I've been able to play the game, I realize I may have let my expectations grow out of control a bit, but I don't mean to imply that this is a bad game. Wanderstop is actually a very, very good game that gave me a lot to think about for the past few weeks, which is more than I can say for most games I play. At the same time, the game feels incomplete in some ways, not so much in the sense that it's missing content, but more so incomplete in how much better the execution of the already great story could have been. While I'm going to be getting into those critiques I have near the end of this video, the rest of Wanderstop is entirely deserving of celebration before I point out those relatively minor issues. So let's get into that. To start off without immediately getting into spoiler territory, I'd like to quickly sing my praises for the game's surface-level aspects before giving my analysis of the story. Firstly, it shouldn't be any surprise based on the footage I've been showing so far that Wanderstop is a beautiful game. Although you shouldn't expect cutting-edge graphical fidelity from an indie game like this, the impeccable art direction and inventive color palettes more than make up for it. That art direction is put on full display by the picturesque cinematic shots shown whenever the player takes a break to sit on a bench, which accompany the player character's contemplative monologues beautifully. Within the titular tea shop, the huge tea-making machine is a striking visual surrounded by a cozy, lovingly decorated interior that the player can flesh out even further with their own photos and trinkets. Every gameplay element and object, from the various plants and fruits to the elaborate dishwasher, and even the relatively unimportant pluffins that walk around the clearing, are given loving attention in terms of their visuals, audio design, and animations that coalesce into elements that feel genuinely satisfying to interact with. And speaking of animation, Wanderstop has some of the best 3D animation out of any indie game I've ever played. These characters that are already quite well characterized through their dialogue derive a great deal of expressiveness from their animations, even during generic conversations through brief animations that extend the thoughts and feelings expressed in text. Additionally, the most story-critical scenes feature their own unique animations that fully sell the critical emotions of these scenes. This intertwines with the game's great character design, which makes for many memorable characters to meet throughout its runtime. But of course, I can't go through all Wanderstop's clear positives without touching on its OST, which is easily the single best aspect of the game, and definitely the best OST to come out of any game in years. In particular, the background tracks that accompany generic gameplay vary in tone, but they all set the stage for the game's relaxing gameplay loop flawlessly. C418's talent for making incredibly memorable, nostalgic-feeling piano melodies is on full display in these songs, and it's what makes this soundtrack so great overall. Of course, the key story scenes aren't neglected in terms of music either, as the soundtrack does have a very effective emotional side as well that helps carry many moments to greatness. Even if you aren't interested in Wanderstop as a game, I can highly recommend this soundtrack to anyone. Now, with all that praise out of the way, I'd like to discuss Wanderstop's story in detail for the rest of this video. I'd been so excited for this game leading up to its release, because Davey Wreden's previous stories have been my absolute favorite kind of densely thematic narratives that always give me a lot to think about, and Wanderstop was no exception in this regard. Although the comedic side of the game's writing failed to speak to me a lot of the time, the excellent thematic core of this story completely makes up for any deficiencies in the moment-to-moment writing. That thematic core is absolutely deserving of a close inspection, so I'd like to take the time to fully flesh out my interpretation of that core right now. I'll now be spoiling the entire story of Wanderstop, so please go play the game for yourself if what I've shown so far interests you. Wanderstop's story follows Alta, a once undefeated fighter who recently suffered several brutal losses, which drives her to seek out the legendary Master Winters in a forest at the edge of the world. On her way through the forest, her sword inexplicably grows too heavy for her to carry, and shortly after she collapses from exhaustion. This serves as the introduction to the titular tea shop and its owner Boro, as Boro saves Alta by bringing her to the clearing that his shop resides in. Since Alta is unable to carry her sword, she agrees to stay with Boro and help with the tea shop until she can carry the sword again and leave. Something is wrong with Alta. Even aside from her strange inability to carry her own sword, her monologue in the forest sometimes has yellow text with an accompanying voiceover that her other lines completely lack, as if it's coming from a deeper place inside her. There's something going on in Alta's head, and the ambiguity of what exactly that is drives a lot of engagement early in the game. At the end of the first chapter, this voice is introduced with a more physical form, a mirror image of Alta that has a golden glow. This is obviously Alta's inner voice, but it's more specifically her ambition, as the voice reminds Alta of her goal of remaining undefeated for the rest of her life, and pushes her to continue to grow more powerful. This inner voice has been Alta's drive throughout her entire life, and that ambition has brought her to incredible heights as a fighter, as is shown through another fighter named Ren who recognizes her at the tea shop and gushes over her history. But while that ambition brings out the best in her, it also brings out the worst. When Alta sits down at a bench with a cup of tea, she offers a monologue that gives some insight into her past, which oftentimes put the toxic aspects of her mentality on full display. Recollections of her distaste for her father over him losing his job through no fault of his own, or the moment she attacked her friend, which inspired her to take boxing lessons, paint a clear picture of her destructive personality that pushed her so far as a fighter. Then, the second chapter ends with the revelation that Alta already found Master Winters deep in the forest, and after realizing that even this legendary master can't single-handedly fix her, her inner voice takes over and attacks Winters unprovoked. After having derived her sense of worth from going undefeated for years, the idea that she can't be fixed through more hard work and training causes her to lash out in violence and hurt the people who only want to help her. But Alta's ambition isn't just destructive to others, it's also arguably even more self-destructive. The end of the third chapter shows that Alta's inner voice equates slowing down to rest with death, but that unwillingness to slow down is what caused her losses, which is now externalized through her exhaustion and inability to carry her own sword. Boro implies that the forest has a supernatural ability to force this introspection in people, which for Alta means forcing her to stop and reflect on what has led up to her current predicament. Even then, her inner voice turns what should be a moment of rest and healing into another stressful exercise that pushes her to her limits in pursuit of greatness. Alta desperately needs to slow down and rest, but so long as she can't keep her ambition under control, she'll continue this self-destructive spiral. The root of Alta's conflict is her hesitancy to change, which is another critical theme that the game puts forward. Part of the forest's challenge to Alta is showing the world changing around her, which is communicated visually through the changing color palette of each chapter, as well as through the stories of the various customers that arrive at the tea shop. In the first chapter, Gerald changes from a comically enthusiastic father into a soft-spoken, crestfallen character after succumbing to a curse. In the second chapter, Ren suffers an injury and similarly falls into a depressive state of mind, which juxtaposes against his previously optimistic personality. Then, the fourth chapter introduces Zenith, who is inexplicably enamored by the businessmen that also appear in this chapter, and they eventually transform into one of those businessmen. While the other two examples of characters changing could be seen as changes for the worse, Zenith's change may be one that's driven by strange motivation, but it's clearly one that the character wants. Zenith is also important because they offer to help Alta find what's wrong with her, which they determine is because her change structure is stuck. While this is a clear statement of Alta's struggle to change, she doesn't understand what Zenith is saying, as the idea of changing herself as a person is unthinkable. This is also explored with what is easily Alta's best resting monologue about her regrets, which I can't do justice with just a brief description.
When I was coming up as a respectable fighter, a young guy came to me and asked me to train him. I agreed, and subsequently I put this kid through the most intense training regimen anyone his age could ever be expected to do. I was brutal on him, because my expectation was only that he become great. After a couple months, I pitted him against a much older and more experienced fighter. Someone I knew had the potential to be reckless. I had this idea that it would bring out something fierce in the kid, awaken a fire in him. It was a disaster. The older fighter broke 2 of the kid's ribs and put him in the hospital. He never came back to see me after that, and for a moment, I felt some kind of regret over it. But what I realized is that this kid had come to me because he knew I would put him through that. Like, obviously, I'm this very intense sort of person, and everyone knew that. So if he came to me and asked for this training, then what was he trying to get out of it? Did he assume I would change who I am just for him? Here's what I think, okay? I think he knew that being a fighter wasn't the right path for him, and so when he came to me, he was specifically looking for something that would push him too far. He wanted, like, an excuse or something. He was looking for a reason to quit. You know how people will do that, right? Like, you can't tell yourself that it's okay to quit, so you have to go and manufacture a circumstance that forces you to stop, because if you stop, then you're a failure. But if someone else forces you to stop, then it's not your fault and you're not a bad person. You're just trying. You're doing your best, and people don't see that. They don't take responsibility and realize that you're the one who wanted it to go too far. You asked for this because you wanted it, not me.
Up to this point in the story, you may have heard all this before if you've played other indie games with similar psychological character studies. I'd be lying if I said that having played Celeste before this game didn't lessen the emotional impact of some of the storytelling here, as that game is also about the main character struggling against a part of themselves that's manifested physically by a location with supernatural powers. But by the end of the game, Wanderstop sets itself apart from Celeste and its other contemporaries in 2 different ways. First, I've heard some people criticize this game for its anticlimactic ending, though I think a more charitable way to describe it is bittersweet. It makes complete sense within the context of the game's themes, as Wanderstop is not about Alta getting better, it's only about her discovering what's wrong with her. Boro puts this as the forest only giving Alta new information, rather than a fix in itself, which is just the first step towards fully healing and becoming better. That does make the ending quite inconclusive and open-ended, but it's something I don't mind in this story's context, as well as in the context of the characters of other stories like this, usually ending up being totally enlightened with all their problems solved. It's a story that feels more grounded in that way, and that's a choice I can appreciate. However, I wouldn't be so positive if that ending was the true climax of Alta's character arc, but thankfully that climax comes earlier, manages to be very satisfying, and from my experience is quite original as well. There's a character named Monster who arrives in the clearing during the game's final chapter, and acts as the final representation of change that Alta has shown, and she's easily the most important representation of change because Alta resists her nature in order to help her. Monster is a child who ran away from home, much like how Alta did as a kid, and she quickly takes a liking to Alta because of her background as a fighter. She's lacking in the discipline that Alta has honed over her lifetime, as is shown by the crude drawings and sculptures she makes around the shop and the surrounding clearing, though she clearly does want to learn to be as strong as Alta when she grows up. But when Monster discovers that Alta can't show her how to fight in her current state, she steals Alta's sword and runs away into the forest. When Alta catches up, Monster lashes out and tells Alta to let her keep the sword. Alta's inner voice appears here to remind her that she's nothing without her sword, but despite her actions being totally controlled by this ambition up to this point in her life, she's able to resist in this moment. While her inner voice feels justified in having attacked Master Winters, Alta's conflict arises from her knowledge that it was a terrible thing she did, to the point where she feels conflicted on whether or not she even deserves the sword at all. But when she lets Monster have the sword, something very important happens. Alta sees Monster's own inner voice, now personified by her possession of the sword. Monster's voice isn't ambitious like Alta's, as it instead laments how Monster drives away her loved ones with her stupid actions. Monster's deepest desire is instead to be a good person and do right by the people around her, which can be seen as the opposite of Alta's unchecked ambition, which pushes away the people closest to her. But Monster's voice hasn't taken control in the same way that Alta's has, probably in part due to her age. Because of this, Alta is able to talk to the personification of her voice and convince it to allow Monster the control that Alta so deeply needs to share with her own voice. The true significance of this moment doesn't arise from how it changes Monster, because it also allows Alta to see her own struggle in another person. Her sword is the physical representation of desire that brings out both her and Monster's inner voices, or more specifically, their true natures. Alta's nature is to chase her ambition of becoming the best possible fighter she can, and that nature is so strong that she struggles to act outside of it. She feels physically ill when she takes any moment to rest that could be used towards realizing her ambition, because that ambition controls her. That control is exactly what Alta needed to become an exceptional fighter, but when it isn't enough to keep her on top, it leads to the lows that she's been pushed to now. Monster is much the same way, though her lack of control instead stems from the lack of control of her inner voice, leading to the selfish actions she takes with no regard for others. Regardless, Alta sees that same struggle for control in Monster, which allows her to rebel against her own voice and actually help another person rather than pushing them aside in pursuit of her ends. Through this, Alta discovers her own potential to change herself like she was able to help Monster change. This is shown symbolically at the very end of this scene, as Alta is able to carry her sword back to the clearing, showing the personal growth that arose from this interaction in a very eloquent way. Wanderstop has some very effective moments of storytelling like this that set it apart from its contemporaries and nearly push it into 10 out of 10 masterpiece territory as well. But this video is also a critique because Wanderstop's storytelling is flawed in other areas. I really enjoyed the game's overall writing and how that writing explores the story's themes, but I was let down by how well it was able to immerse me in Alta's struggle. This specifically relates to the aspect of the game that I've been neglecting up to this point, which is its gameplay. I found Wanderstop's gameplay loop to be quite enjoyable, particularly the simple puzzles of figuring out what ingredients to use to fulfill each customer's tea requests, as well as the preparatory resource gathering and gardening. It's a very relaxing, peaceful routine that allows the player to take in the excellent visual and audio design at their own pace, and that's something to appreciate in this game that's all about the virtues of taking a moment to rest and reflect. But what I've realized over my years of playing games is that the difference between a 9 out of 10 and a 10 out of 10 story told through the interactive medium usually comes from how interactivity is used to strengthen that story. If the mantra of great filmmaking is show don't tell, then the mantra of great interactive storytelling is experience don't tell. Wanderstop presents Alta's struggle with her own ambitious nature as its core conflict, but that conflict is rarely embodied in any part of the game's interactive elements. The one standout moment of interactivity found in the game is its brief third chapter that comes just after Alta remembers her disastrous meeting with Master Winters. The cold, uninviting color palette and lack of music already externalizes Alta's despondent mental state quite well, but the game also lacks its usual gameplay loop for this chapter. Instead, the player is only given the weed cutters for the Sisyphean task of cutting quickly and endlessly respawning weeds. For this short section, Wanderstop allows the player to experience Alta's struggle over the realization of her misdeeds through the dramatic shift away from its typical gameplay. The rest of the game, however, was severely lacking in this regard, which led to my experience of playing the game feeling disconnected from the story's conflict. This is an instance of ludonarrative dissonance that's very unfortunate, because the way that the game is able to communicate Alta's conflict through traditional writing and visual aspects is done a great disservice by what little regard was given for communicating that conflict through interactivity. I found it easy to sympathize with Alta's plight simply based on the traditional storytelling techniques the game employs, but the best stories told through video games are those that can use interactivity to align the player's emotions with the character's emotions, transforming that sympathy into a much more powerful sense of empathy. Some players will immediately connect with Alta's struggle based on their own life experience, but for players like me who didn't immediately see themselves in that conflict, the game does little to build that empathy in the unique way that interactivity is capable of. More than anything, this is where Wanderstop failed to meet my admittedly very high expectations. I simply didn't feel much personal connection to Alta's struggle because, while the game's writing often insists on Alta's frustration with being stuck working the tea shop, I was very much enjoying the meditative gameplay loop. I understand that the changes to the game's design I'm about to suggest are difficult ones to go ahead with, since they arguably make the game less fun from a conventional standpoint, but I do think these minor tweaks to the game's design could greatly strengthen this story's emotional appeal. To illustrate the benefits that would come along with these changes, I'd like to highlight a short line from Wanderstop's Steam store page that stuck out to me. The shop demands patience. It rejects those who have only come in the pursuit of growth unchecked. This line clearly relates to Boro's speech at the very end of the 5th chapter about the virtues of boredom and the dangers of never giving yourself a break, as well as the generic conversation that happens when Alta asks what she should do next, which follows a very similar thematic through line. This is exactly the lesson that Alta needs to learn in order to continue forward with her passions in a healthier, less destructive way. However, Wanderstop's gameplay does little to reinforce this theme, because the game always gives the players something to do that works towards the goal of seeing this story to its conclusion, so I never felt as if I had nothing to do at any point during the game. Even if you're not actively making tea for your customers, you can be out collecting tea leaves, gardening to discover and collect more fruits, or greeting new arrivals to the clearing to collect more tasks. Wanderstop is happy to allow the player to play impatiently and rush through all of its content without imposing any sort of thematically relevant roadblocks on that progress, which I think was a huge missed opportunity when it could have reinforced its themes interactively by putting up those roadblocks. I never truly felt bored while playing the game, but introducing a bit of boredom to the game would have gone a long way in connecting the gameplay experience to the story. If I was to make a change to the game's design towards this end, there are a few different things I would test. First, the shop's customers have a cooldown after talking to them that must expire before you can advance to their next conversation, but this cooldown is typically very short. I would usually find myself going to talk to another character for a minute or so before another character would have something new to say, which would result in a chain of conversations that didn't allow for any downtime at all. This is a place where downtime could easily be introduced in a very natural way by extending the cooldown between conversations, which could encourage the player to take the time to wander around the clearing or just sit at a bench and soak in the serene visuals and music. Another change I would test in this same vein is expanding the gardening systems, which are very basic in the game as is. Specifically in pursuit of adding downtime to the game, I would try making the player wait for at least a minute or two before they can water their plant and make it bear seeds or fruit. Even if these changes don't succeed in getting players to slow down, there are even more heavy-handed, riskier changes that could be made. For instance, a stamina system that causes Alta to move slower over time could be added, which would only be alleviated by sitting on a bench for a short time. By creating moments that halt the player's otherwise unimpeded forward progress, the player can more easily connect with Alta's struggle, as the experience of playing the game would evoke her frustration with being kept away from her own forward progress. But I would go even further than this by targeting some more fundamental mechanics present in the game. If you want to slow down the pace of the game and allow for downtime, the mechanics to target are those that allow the player to play the game faster. For Wanderstop, the prime candidate for this mechanic is sprinting. I don't think sprinting should be removed as an option, but I do think that altering its implementation could reinforce the story's themes through interactivity by punishing the player for overusing it. The best idea I have is to make Alta randomly trip and fall over while she's sprinting, which would reflect both her exhaustion and inability to carry her sword, as well as the virtue of slowing down to smell the flowers that the game promotes. You could even make her drop items when she trips, even spilling cups full of tea if that's what she's carrying, creating a totally emergent moment that punishes the player for lacking patience and reinforcing Alta's struggle with her own need to get better and faster at everything. These would also be great topics for conversation between Alta and Boro, as they already talk to each other about other emergent gameplay events, which would complete this symbiosis between gameplay and story. Adding other emergent slap-on-the-wrist moments like this that punish impatient play could create the ludonarrative harmony that this game sorely lacks as is, and I suspect that with changes like that, I could really call this game a masterpiece of interactive storytelling. As much as I wish I had this hypothetical version of Wanderstop to play and see if it really would be better this way, I unfortunately don't, so I can't say for sure whether or not I really would have loved these changes in practice. But what I can say for certain is that it would be very elitist of me to write this game off for these issues combined with my own bloated expectations for this game. As I said at the start of this video, Wanderstop is a very, very good game, so I'd like to end on a positive note. I very much enjoyed my time playing this game, but as is often the case with these densely thematic stories, I enjoy the experience of thinking about the narrative and arriving at my own interpretations of the text even more. In the world of video games, these sorts of stories are unfortunately a very rare treat, so I think it's important that I give extra credit where it's due to the games that manage to get better the more I think about them. Wanderstop is absolutely one of those games, and that's what makes it a great game despite its flaws.